ahead and get started here. So many of you know who I am. My name's Bonnie Bright, and I'm the founder of Depth Psychology Alliance, which of course is the organization that is making this possible. And for those of you who don't know, many of you are avid supporters of Depth Psychology Alliance, but this is completely a volunteer organization. I started it just about 5 years ago with the intention as someone who is really passionate about depth psychology and was a grad student at the time, earning my Ph.D. at Pacifica. I just got excited about the idea of creating an online organization that would make depth psychology more accessible to everyone. And so I kind of went home and started doing it. And here we are now. So if you would like to join Depth Psychology Alliance, it's free to join as an online community, and you can do so at www.depthpsychologyalliance.com. And again, because we're a completely volunteer run, we are not officially a nonprofit yet. There's been some talk about doing that, but we are really funding everything ourselves and rely completely on donations from people. So really appreciate it if you are willing to support us in that way. And huge thanks to everybody that was willing to support by making a small donation to this particular webinar. So having said that, I'm here with Dr. Carol Pearson. Carol, thank you so much for being with me today.
I'm happy to be with you.
Well, it's really exciting to have you here. I'm going to just share with everybody a bio for Carol. Probably most of you know who she is. She's quite well known and has already several books to her name that are quite well known in depth psychology circles in particular, and in Jungian and even business circles, much to your credit, Carol. But I'm going to go ahead and read your bio so that people have it, and we have it here for the record. And then we're going to launch into a depth psychological discussion about your brand new book called Persephone Rising, Awakening the Heroine Within. So Carol S. Pearson, Ph.D. and also D.Min, is an internationally known authority on archetypes and their application to leadership, organizational development, and everyday life. And she's best known for her books such as The Hero Within, 6 Archetypes We Live By, and Awakening the Heroes Within, 12 Archetypes to Help Us Find Ourselves. And also one that I particularly love, Mapping the Organizational Psyche, a Jungian theory of organizational dynamics and change, and that she co-authored with John Corlett. So, as I mentioned, her newest book, Persephone Rising, Awakening the Heroes Within, is written for women and the men who partner with them at home, at work, or in the community. That pretty much covers them all, doesn't it, Carol? I'm excited to dig into this. And so the book's purpose is to help women thrive in today's complex world, and also the men with them, I assume, while also making a contribution to others and to the greater good. So that's a lovely mission. A respected scholar and higher education administrator, Dr. Pearson served most recently as Executive Vice President and Provost, and then President of Pacifica Graduate Institute, which, as many of you know, is also my alma mater. And previously, she was a Professor of Leadership Studies in the School of Public Policy and the Director of the James McGregor Burns Academy of Leadership. And she was also a member of the ILA, which is the International Leadership Association's Board of Directors. So you can find more about Carol on her website at carolspearson.com. And Carol, I know that you have a few upcoming events that are out in the real world. And so at the end of this, remind me and let's talk about those so that people will know how to find those if they'd like to. Great. Well, thank you again for being here. I've been looking forward to this ever since we set it up, because your books, as I mentioned, are quite well known, and you really have a gift, I think, for digging into the archetypal patterns that are behind the stories that are going on in our lives. And so I know we'll spend some time talking about that today, but maybe we could start with a question that might be really obvious to some people, and maybe not so much to others, but that is really, this book is about an ancient myth. And it's been around for a long, long time. Most people know the story of Persephone and particularly Demeter, her mother. But why do you think that people should care about this particular myth, being ancient as it is in our current and contemporary and very fast-moving, I might add, society?
Well, I got interested in it because it grabbed me by the neck, which often happens, and personally has meant a lot to me. But as I began to research it, because I felt called to write this book at this time, I realized what an amazing myth it was. And of course, myths are encoded archetypes that are related to the way we think, the way we feel, our growth and maturation as people. They also reflect the culture that they're in, so that the issue we have with an ancient myth is how to update it to be relevant to what we're doing today. What I found, one, I had known this, but I didn't really realize what it meant. The story of Demeter and Persephone was the basis of the most revered ancient mystery tradition in Greece, ancient Greece. Of all of the other mystery traditions, virtually everybody who was anybody went through that tradition. It took 9 days. You had to walk 14 miles a couple of times. It required a whole lot of people. And it was culturally, I think it was a social change movement. Because it was an extremely patriarchal and hierarchical society. And yet anybody could come. Men and women were together, which they often weren't. Slaves were there with kings. It was truly amazing. But what's most important, I think, from a depth psychological perspective, is that the main characters in that story actually act out for us really primal archetypal patterns that, if we pay attention to them, can make us happy. And the promise of the Eleusinian mysteries was that you would be happy, prosperous, and relatively free of fear. Not bad.
Not bad at all.
Yeah.
You bring up a really important point, and you know, this is a time and also an event, these Eleusinian mysteries, that is really magnetizing almost. It's a time, and it offers a sense of something powerful that I think all of us are instinctively drawn to, and that is a sense of ritual and also of initiation to some extent, in the sense that everybody who went there obviously was going through something that helped them to get to know themselves a bit better. And what's really fascinating about it actually is that it was happening as a normal part of the society at that time. And it occurs to me that in our current society, we still have rituals, but our rituals have been widely replaced with something completely different and worshiping completely different gods than they did then.
Yes. And these gods and goddesses were not like our gods today. They weren't aspirational, particularly, in the sense that they were perfect and what we ought to be. Their stories would really would parallel a human story and give us a sense of, like, most of them came from dysfunctional families, for example. I mean, really, Zeus and Demeter both, you know, their father was eating all their children. That's pretty bad.
Yeah.
Dionysus, everybody was trying to kill him, and he was disguised as a girl, which made him kind of androgynous. And it was so painful that he went mad. I mean, these gods, you know, there are all these books out here right now about how to be happy. And mainly they start out with something easy to do, like we just visualized, or be grateful, or this or that. But what these gods and goddesses were illustrating to us, or to them, and can to us, is you can start out with a very difficult situation and move to something wonderful. And that's what a lot of it was about. And it was also an evolving ritual. People were not allowed to tell the secrets of the Eleusinian mysteries. But the truth is, it was very experiential. And so people would walk away with very different ideas of what happened, which meant that it was tailored to the actual person, in the sense that they had to make sense of it in the context of their own lives.
Yes, and I know some of those kinds of rituals obviously are still available to us. Anybody who has been deeply involved in depth psychology has probably at least attended some sort of, I don't know, workshop or class or something that has been led by a Jungian analyst or a depth psychologist or a shaman of sorts, or a caretaker who can sort of make sense of sort of what is happening to us and put in context, you know, whatever stories are unfolding in those. And I suppose that myths do the same kind of thing, but in the book you share a very personal story about which actually led you to the myth of Persephone. I wondered if you would be willing to just briefly tell us about that for those who haven't read the book, to begin to understand how you were led into this particular myth.
Well, it was actually quite a while ago, in my 30s, early 30s, when I met my perfect guy, and I was feeling very much on the top of the world. I was in love. I'd gotten my perfect job at the University of Colorado as a professor. Everything was going really well, and then David, my dreamboat, had a guy then, and my husband now. Um, he had 3 sons, and from a previous marriage, and they very much like Demeter. Demeter's story starts when she finds out that her daughter Persephone is gone, and she doesn't know where she is. And Doug was gone, and turned out he had drowned in the company of a babysitter. I'm not going to go on about that because then I'll still get sad. But I knew the story of Demeter and Persephone, and I got incredibly comforted by the story of Demeter. And I didn't much track the whole rest of the story. It was that experience, and that there was a goddess that had been very important to a whole culture, whose story was what I was experiencing. It's what I wasn't actually the mother, but I loved this child.
Can you, sorry to interrupt you, can you just say something, maybe briefly recap the story of Demeter and who she is? I think, again, most people probably know, but just for general purposes, it would be great to hear it again.
Yeah, I will. And I'd also like to just flesh that out a little bit, what I just said, because it taught me, I already knew about archetypes, but it taught me something about archetypes that I hadn't known before. That, and in my view, they're basic parts of our psyche, but they also connect us with all the other people in all times and places who've experienced some of the same thing. And in that way, they keep gaining power and complexity. And that seems to me really important to know about an archetype, and recognize that that the embodiment of this whole energy field is an image that we call Demeter, who has a story. So Demeter starts out, and she's the goddess of grain. Maybe originally she was also the Earth Mother. She's also a mother goddess, because she's known primarily in her relationship to being a mother. And she's off with some of the other goddesses, probably doing a little business. And her daughter, she thinks, is safe playing in the meadow, and she comes back to find out she's gone, and no one will tell her where Persephone has gone to and what has happened to her. Everybody says they don't know. She eventually, with some help from Hecate, learns from Apollo that actually Hades, the god of the underworld, had asked Zeus, who was Persephone's father, for her hand in marriage. And Zeus said, okay, sure, you can have her.
And fathers did at the time.
I'm not quite that bad. I bet they didn't after the Eleusinian mysteries took over. But, and so Hades, being a kind of impetuous guy, comes up from the underworld where the dead live, and he abducts her down to the underworld. Some of the stories say that he raped her. My interpretation of the myth is that he didn't. The most reliable source is Homer's poem about Demeter, and that he abducted her, but he did not. And he was, of course, approved to be married to her at that time. Demeter is absolutely distraught with grief at losing her daughter, but she is also furious with Zeus. I mean, really seriously furious, because he has disrespected her by not asking her or Persephone her opinion of this. And she then searches, she just wanders because she doesn't know what to do. And she disguises herself as an old peasant woman till she's helped by a royal family in Eleusis and treated kindly. There's a sub-story that's too long to get into at this moment. But eventually, she gets angry. And when she gets angry, she suddenly reveals her whole goddess self. And she says, build me a temple, which the people terrified of her, realizing she's a goddess, do. And she sits in her temple and says, nobody eats until I get my daughter back, refusing to let the grain grow. Eventually, as the mortals start to die, Zeus realizes that he will, that if they all die, they'll stop having sacrifices to the gods, so he gives in. Persephone comes back. There's a whole other story about Persephone that I could tell now, but I won't. Persephone comes back, and having eaten some pomegranate seeds, she has to go back. I think chose to go back for part of the year, and from then on, she's a goddess that can be in the upper world or the lower, the underworld, going back and forth. And some people say she could go wherever she wanted. And so that she became a kind of shamanistic kind of figure, of being able to travel between the worlds. Eventually, Zeus, who learned a few things, has a big party, welcomes them back, and all the gods celebrate.
Yeah, that's really powerful, isn't it? And I love that you added that addendum sort of toward the end there about her becoming kind of a shamanic personality, because this capacity to walk between the two worlds and the willingness to go is something that I think everybody who understands to some extent what the idea of Jungian individuation is something that every one of us is called to do. But it's not always easy to do, is it? I mean, she was maybe originally abducted and against her will and taken there, but like you, I've heard some versions of the story that say that she actually went willingly. And so when she goes back and forth between these two, it's my opinion that each time she goes, she's just deepening into that capacity to be with the darkness of things as they are. And unless we're willing to face that darkness, there's no way that we can ever continue to grow and transform.
Well, and these myths are layered. They can mean a lot of things, and they mean that. But it's also just in-depth psychology, going to the unconscious and into the conscious world, conscious world, which I think was implied by what you said, but I really wanted to hone that. It's also about, there are some people who have said that really treat her as a victim in the whole story, sort of destined to have to go to the underworld for half the year where this awful man abducted, hurt her and whatever. I just didn't think that, there's pretty much evidence that the Eleusinian mysteries were created by women initially, and it was the women's initiation rite. Now, why would you tell that to a 13-year-old? You wouldn't have a great transformational religion based on that. So that the key moment of taking the pomegranate seeds, eating the pomegranate seeds, the way I imagine it and wrote about it, is that she's down there, she's become, she has a great way of making the best of whatever situation is she's in, because she's so in touch with her inner calling and her sense of who she is. And so she's in the underworld, she becomes the queen of the underworld, which she actually was in ancient Crete way before this story was ever written. And you can imagine her. She's, if she were a person, she'd be about 15 or 16 years old when this story is happening. So she's an adolescent. And she figures that her mother will try to rescue her. She knows her mother adores her, and her mother's very powerful. And so the question is, do I want to go back to the underworld? And so she's sitting there, and every time she thinks about just being in the upper world or just being in the lower world, she gets depressed. But finally, how when Jung talked about the transcendent function, when you get stuck between two impossible polarities and you don't know what to do, and an image pops into your mind, and suddenly you do. So she thinks pomegranate seeds. she knows there was an ancient law that said if you eat anything in the underworld, you have to go back. So she carefully eats the number of pomegranate seeds that will get her exactly what she wants.
So she was actually following some kind of a calling. You may think that's sort of premeditated and manipulative, I suppose, on some level. But on the other hand, that idea occurred to her from somewhere, right? So there is a bigger pattern at work, is there not?
Well, it's from the unconscious. Those kind of images, the power of the image is it comes from the unconscious.
Yes.
And very often it is the calling, and it is, and the story. If you really look at the story in the context of the Eleusinian mysteries, one of the things they said is they changed that story and that practice changed the relationship of human beings to the gods. From one in which there was a phrase in the Homer poem about the gods are like yokes on our neck. We have to do what they say. And the gods are punishing. And after that, at least in the Eleusinian gods and goddesses, were your friend. They were your bud. They were going to see that you were going to be fine, and after you died or whatever happened to you. And you can see this even in there are high church and low church Jungians, essentially, who could there are very few serious analysts who would say this, but there are people who almost take the message from the gods, from the unconscious or their dreams, as a yoke around their neck. I must do that. And that shift of the relationship with the gods is also a shift in our relationship with archetypal energies. They can be our friend.
Yes.
But they can only be our friends if we're conscious of them. And if we're conscious of them and respectful at the same time, then they can help us grow and develop in really quite amazing ways.
Right. Yeah. So what I hear you saying is that this story is really about, metaphorically, about dialoguing with the unconscious and entering into some kind of relationship with the unconscious or the gods or that larger pattern, whatever it is that people prefer to call it. Why don't we dig in a little bit to archetypal psychology, because archetypal psychology really is the study of perceiving patterns and understanding how can everybody who's listening to this, I guess, really begin to kind of dip a toe into the water to understand what those patterns are that are going on in anybody's particular life?
Well, all of my work is kind of 101 on that subject, because it's my belief that if we're being run, the archetypes do have yokes around our neck if we are unconscious of them, and mythic patterns. We think that's where neuroscience comes in, which is just telling us then that we don't see the world around us exactly the way it is. We see it filtered through the stories in our brain, the stories we're telling ourselves. And so we're thinking that's reality, and then we act on that. Well, something's got us by the neck when that happens. And it's really big to understand that in the world today. Cognitive behavioral people are getting it. But the difference between and there's a lot of stuff that's being said that is too simple, which is just, change your story.
Right.
Okay, I was abused as a child, and now I'm going to say it was a happy child.
Sure.
Nobody really advocates that, but there are people who make this so simple to change a story that you have in your head. But if you can begin to name the story, just name it. And if you can name it, there's a possibility of changing the form of it. But if in-depth psychology, when we are also connecting to what archetypal story is that? And what archetype am I in? Then there are all kinds of versions of those stories. Demeter's first story is that her daughter's gone. She hates Zeus. All she can do is leave Olympus and wander, being miserable. And yet she changes that story, essentially. It claims her power, but she knows what story she's in. I mean, she's not pretending it's a different story than what what is actually happening. And in Persephone Rising, I show how really all of the, you know, all of the major characters do that. In some ways, they're gods and goddesses, but they're living a version of the story that makes them unhappy. And without denying what is real and happening in their lives, they change the story, and then different and better things begin to happen.
Right, right. And I just feel so strongly, what's coming through for me so strongly in this moment is our own willingness to engage with that story that it is. So unless we really are truly willing to sort of surrender and recognize first that we are in a story, and then to start looking for those patterns that we're in, we can't begin to allow that change to happen. And it's like you said, it's not easy to just change your story, but as we begin to enter into that story and engage with the characters that are there and to understand the plot line, if you will, of what's going on, then we create that space for something new to arise out of that, just as the seeds arose for Persephone.
You know, and Jungian analysts very typically will ask clients that are open to that to study the archetype, the archetype that they see in what's happening with them, what their complex is, what their difficulty is. And Hillman said all our pathologies are calls from the gods. You know, I love all that. And so what I'm doing in a book like Persephone Rising, or other people are doing that really study a particular myth and apply it to the modern world, is to help people be able to see what the versions of how people, and in this case gods and goddesses, can grapple with a similar situation and a similar challenge and move to a more positive narrative. Right. And positive ways to live in it, because with what I was saying about archetypes being influenced by all of our experience of it for as long as there's been humans, and I think in some of these are animals too. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of range.
Yes.
So in some ways, it seems to me that we have images that come to us that get us out of tight spots where we can imagine we're just called to something. It's kind of like the Grail showing up, you know, only, you know, a friend of mine had the vision of moving to New Mexico, but, you know, it's different in the modern world and what would come to us. But it's the narratives and the variety of the narratives within a particular archetype that give us the flexibility in terms of personal choice to recognize we're in the story, but the story doesn't have to define it in one way.
Right, right. Yeah. So, yeah, I really appreciated you being willing to share a little bit about your story of how you came to be called in a way to this myth of Persephone. And I'm wondering, is that really the best recommendation that you might make for people who want to engage in this kind of work, who are seeking transformation? Is it best if they just kind of go looking for what their personal myth is, or their story, or what story they're living out in that moment? Is that a way to start, or what do you recommend most, Carol?
Oh, it definitely is a way to start. And for some people, it's like, why do they love a certain movie? Mm-hmm. You know, if they don't know a lot about archetypes yet, or why. I started reading cozy mystery stories, which are very sweet little mystery stories with female sleuths in an intact neighborhood. Of course, I'm flying all over the place doing everything. Now I'm living in I'm not, right now I'm in Santa Barbara, but I'm living in a neighborhood where I'm starting to meet people. I had people for tea. Wow. You know, it can start with, it doesn't have to be always archetypal. I chose, the myth of Demeter and Persephone chose me, but I chose to write about the myth because I realized how many people relate to it. That those archetypes are so core to in the book I talk about primal archetypes, that they're really about very primal task about being human. That we need to be happy, to thrive, and we need to survive as a species. Mm-hmm. And so I wrote about it because I think so many people are attracted to it. And you see a lot of women have written about the story in different ways, sometimes very personally. There are any number. I went to Goodreads, and I just put in Persephone, and you had pages and pages of novels that were based on the myth that are out now. So I do think that we should start where we are, and that this myth isn't for everybody. You need to find, it's ideal to be able to find the bigger story that you're in, and one that gives you a huge amount of room. Mm-hmm. And also, what I like about this one and many others in mythology is it doesn't pretend that life is simpler than it is. That, you know, you can have had really horrible things happen to you. You could have done horrible things. Whatever it is, it provides a context to move to a better place that doesn't pretend that it's so, you know, simple.
Right. Yes. Yes. And when you start looking at archetypes, and I really liked what you said earlier, you said the archetypes continually gain power. And what I added to that, whether it's what you meant or not, I'm not sure, but what I added to that was they gain power as we each experience those kind of archetypal situations and stories and even energies over time. I just had this vision of kind of every one of our personal experiences being added to this basket of a particular archetype, where that just grows and grows and grows in power, and therefore has more power over more people. And you might argue that in our culture today, there certainly are very specific archetypes that are in play right now, that whose patterns are overarching and pulling us in to a great extent. In fact, we're possessed by some of those archetypes. Do you have ideas about what some of those might be that we're facing collectively as a culture today?
Well, we're in political season.
Mm-hmm.
It's so interesting. I mean, it's really clear. There's a lot of kind of revolutionary archetypal energy in the populace, and you can just see, you know, Bernie Sanders is an example of that. I mean, he's really calling us to revolution, and many of the Republican candidates are moving even into the let's tear it down, let's tear it all down. So and the revolutionary is part of our cultural heritage. I mean, it was there at the founding of the country. But I think that's situational, and it comes out in times of unhappiness and unrest of various kinds. But and now I'm not talking about mythological archetypal names, just more like I talk about in Awakening the Heroes Within, or the Hero Within, but more like process archetypes. I think our culture is in a huge warrior position. You can't, I just noticed that the only way candidates can get covered is if they attack somebody.
Yeah.
You know, and Donald Trump is doing extremely well, primarily by insulting and attacking people, and is partly being created by the media in that way. And increasingly the warrior energy that has always been there is just in our culture wars and in the conflict between the two parties has gotten to be almost as if it were a war. Mm-hmm. I get fundraising notes. As saying that they were going to, they needed my money to crush the opposition. we're talking about other Americans, you know, really.
But this is yeah, sorry.
Yeah. Anyway, those are two of the things that are just huge.
Yes, yeah, there seem to be archetypes that are expressing very strongly, and frankly, when it comes to politics, I'm not sure that that things have shifted radically in the last several decades. It seems like, at least for a long time, this whole sort of attack format has been widely used, and I guess successful to certain levels. But it makes you start looking at the question of, if we were actually living out the pattern of a different god or goddess, or a different archetype. For example, if we were focused more on the maternal and the feminine, the feminine way of doing things, as we talk about in Jungian psychology, imagine how dramatically different not just the election would be or the politics, but the leadership of our country and the world itself.
Right. It would be hugely different. For one thing, we'd be trying to solve problems.
Right.
I mean, there is, you know, and we would, there's the fact, you know, there's research now that suggests that some of the women in Congress and in legislatures are better at reaching across the aisle because they're used to listening, because there is that quality. And I think some of that is very Demeter. I tend to go, you know, if you raise children and you take care of the elderly and the sick, you gotta listen. Gotta pay attention. You try to, and with babies and really little ones, they can't even tell you what it is they need. So you have to be able to have empathy and watch their body language and figure it out. Well, imagine, what if that's what we were all doing? And instead of it, you know, like instead of it attacking the other party, thinking, well, what's going on with them? What do they really think? What do they feel? What are they scared of? And not that there's none of that going on. And if we had a little Persephone, we would be thinking, okay, not this, not that, what?
Yeah. How do we bridge? How do we
bridge? How do we bridge? How do we listen to each other? How do we connect? How do we reconceptualize? And again, I'm going to the transcendent function. How do we move out of the ideology of either group and move to something else?
Yeah.
Because we're at that time. I mean, you know, the Democrats and Republicans are still fighting about whether we're going to care for people or not.
Right, or not, which is yeah.
Yeah, the counter-revolution is or not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Carol, in your book, you at the end of each of the chapters, I noticed you have recommended exercises for people to do, and each one seems to consist of recommending a dialogue with one of the characters that you are talking about in the book. Can you share a little bit about how that process might look and or what people can gain by doing that? I'm just looking for ways that each one of us can kind of walk away from this today and say, wow, I can go try that myself. It's a concrete way to do things, even if we don't normally do that kind of practice in daily life.
Actually, I found that you'd think having a journal conversation with an archetype would be really difficult. And but the great thing about archetypes is they're really archetypal. They're really in us. They're part of our deep programming. We recognize them. They know, you know, particularly if I say warrior or sage or caregiver, I don't have to explain that. There's a whole confluence of knowledge that we have. So it's, for some people, it's fairly easy to say, okay, Dionysus, how can I have more fun in my life? And then write a little bit more and then let Dionysus speak. For other people, that's harder, but Jean Houston had a great exercise that really, that helps make that accessible to almost anybody, which is writing gibberish and then speaking gibberish and then going back to writing gibberish and then ask your question to Dionysus, and you have opened the channels to your creativity and to your right brain and to the unconscious very simply in that kind of way. But even so, for some people, I'm a writer, so that would be natural for me, and it's natural for a lot of people that are readers, because to be able to write in that kind of way. But for some people, it's painting a picture. What if I painted a picture of Demeter, for example, if I wanted to connect with her, or danced her, or for some people, even that is too much. Look at memoirs about people like that. You know, realize, okay, what is she like? She's a caring person. Or what is Persephone like? She's going to be going between the worlds. She's a shamanistic kind of woman. Zeus, he wants to be in charge. And just start reading some books. No, it could be novels, or it could be memoirs, or it could be biographies, to jumpstart that narrative in your life. The other piece that I would say is find people that, if you say I actually need a lot more Zeus because everybody's walking all over me. Well, find some Zeus buddies to hang out with. Find the temple where Zeus lives. Go take martial arts or something. You see where I'm saying.
See where it hangs out.
All kinds of simple things that people can do to help connect, to shore up a certain archetypal energy in them that they need.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's some real value in bringing that into more of a concrete form. For example, I know some of earth-based cultures and indigenous peoples, when they do dream practices, it's absolutely required and necessary that they do something to create an image that comes from a dream that they might have had when it's finished, because that's what brings it into this world and anchors it, right? So if we don't work with the dream in some way that is actually concrete for them, it symbolizes not only a lack of respect, but also an incapacity to retain what it is that the dream brought us, the gift that the dream.
Absolutely, yeah. And that ritual of all kinds does that. You can also look at your dreams from the Eleusinian mysteries or another mythology if you want. Because if a lot of times people don't pay attention to the actual narrative structure of their dream. And I mean, Hillman helped us stop analyzing and start saying, what is this image? What does a snake want for me that's in my dream, rather than analyzing the snake. But there's also the narrative patterns. Is this a Demeter? Is this a Demeter dream? Is this a dream about caring for somebody or failing to care about somebody? Is this a destroyer dream when you are actually being chased by somebody who might want to kill you, and of course recognizing that you are all the characters in that dream. That I think there's just a whole, it can be really cool. To look at your dreams that way and think that this dream may be telling me that I'm in this story, what story I'm in. Yes. And then you can follow up from that about what is it telling you, and what else, particularly if it's a cautionary dream of some kind, what else might you be doing within that structure? For example, if you have in the destroyer archetype, there's a tendency to want to just get out of it, but usually, or very often, it's a story where you need to just destroy something. And I don't mean go shoot people, but to let go of certain patterns, to get out of certain relationships, and that, and that moving to that more positive and affirming way of dealing with the destroyer by becoming the positive destroyer, which is like weeding the garden, can be very, very easy to move towards.
Yeah, that's a great example, the whole weeding the garden thing.
Yeah.
So, and you know what, one way that depth psychologists look at this too is to ask the question, who's visiting? So in your dream, if you have a dream about Mrs. Johnson, who's your neighbor next door, it may be Mrs. Johnson, or it may be one of the goddesses that is actually, coming to call and has a message or a reason for coming to call. And so if you start looking at it as, okay, which goddess is that? Which goddess is visiting me in this disguise? And beginning to look at it from that perspective, it gives you a completely different way to work with dreams.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this is so fascinating, Carol. I feel like we could go on forever. What I'd like to do, because we're about 12 minutes now away from the end of the hour, and I would love to open this up to the audience to see if people would like to make comments or share experiences that you've had with archetypes or archetypal patterns or stories or dreams or whatever it is that occurs to you from this conversation. And in order for you to be able to talk, what you'll need to do is raise your electronic hand, and you should see a button there. And so as soon as we see you raise that hand, we'll unmute you. And then for everybody that does that, and I see somebody just raise their hand, so we're going to go to Ginger in just a moment. Good. So, but what you can do is if you'd like to turn on your camera, you may do so. We'd be happy to see you up here while we're talking, but you don't have to turn on your camera. Feel free to do so if you'd like. And if once we unmute you, you roll your cursor across the screen, then you'll see the start video pop up there, and you can just click that. So let's go ahead. And Jeremy, I just wanted to acknowledge Jeremy Taylor. Sorry, I know Jeremy Taylor, but this is Jeremy Murray. Jeremy Murray. Sorry, Jeremy, I know you. Jeremy is our volunteer for handling the back end of this technology, and is also very avid about psychology as well. So thank you so much to Jeremy for being with us. And Jeremy, if you could just manage that process, because I have the Periscope people watching my screen, I can't really go back and forth between the questions in the chat like I normally would. So Jeremy, maybe you could just call on people sort of in the order that they raise their hands, and if you'd like to let them unmute themselves, that would be great. Thank you. So while we're waiting for them to get unmuted and come on, maybe we can just, well, I don't want to start a whole new question because somebody's going to have one, so let's just hang tight for just a second. And maybe I will need to do that. Okay, sorry, Jeremy's not seeing hands. Technology, we love it. Okay, so Ginger, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Thankfully, I can do that. I'm not sure why, Jeremy, because the last time I couldn't do it and you could. So here we go. Touche. All right, so Ginger, you should be unmuted now. And if you would like to start your video, please feel free to do so. And let's see, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Oh, there we go, Ginger. Okay, now you can talk. Hello, Ginger. Ginger, you are unmuted. Can you say something? Not having any luck. So I'm not sure if you're having a trouble with your sound, or, you know, some computers actually don't have microphones built into them. I'm not saying that's the case, but let's go on, and I'm going to take one from Sperry until maybe, Ginger, you can figure something out, or it could be a question of sound. So Sperry, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, and you are live now, so you can either turn on your camera or just start talking.
Okay, I'm looking for where I turn on the camera.
Just roll your mouse on the screen and you'll see to the left at the bottom a little start video button.
Left at the bottom. I see, there we go.
There we go.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. This is really a wonderful dialogue and exploration. I'm wondering the role of consciousness as we think of it today, that's a non-dual level of us all, that there's no gender specific or even story, there's no self, if you will. There's this no self, which through our awareness of the self, we're able to let go of being unconscious and trapped into a certain interpretation of the archetype, and therefore create that new version that is unique to each of us, and grow and empower these archetypes. How do you understand consciousness in that sense, or thoughtless awareness, as in this paradigm that you're exploring?
For me? Oh, okay.
Yeah, either of you.
Yeah, people have used my work in two ways. One is to use their normal rational thinking, mind thinking, in recognizing their archetypes and work at it at that level, because that's easy for a lot of people. But what I would think of as consciousness is deeper than that. It's sort of the goal of meditation, when you let go of the busy mind and something else percolates up. And it's I believe that same reality that we can find from the Eastern tradition of meditation does connect us with the unconscious and with the self, as Jung talked about the self, which is not just our personal self, but a self that's connected to the whole. And that's why it's from there that we get breakthrough understandings or images that lead us in a whole new direction, because we're not operating disconnected from the rest of the world, which very often in our left brain particular thinking, we're cut off, we're in our own heads. And often thinking only of ourselves and what we want, but not necessarily, or we might be thinking about what everybody else should do. And I'm a great believer in logical thinking and creative thinking, but I do think the consciousness place is connected. And it's out of that connected place that we're more likely to be able to live our lives with a sense of purpose that is also in some ways very connected to the earth and to the other people on the planet and to spirit. And that's where wiser decisions come from that are less likely to boomerang because they hurt other people or they come back at us because there's some input from the whole. I don't know if that's my view.
Yeah, I agree, and I appreciate that, Carol. And I would just add that that sense of connectedness or that understanding or sense of knowing that there's something larger than ourselves at work, that there's a pattern there, and that we have the capacity to dialogue with it in the sense that it will respond to us. It's something that's animate and alive and intelligent, and it's a presence. It's a presence that is with us. So thank you so much for your questions, Barry. I'd love to continue this. We have so many people raising their hands. We're going to move on to the next person, but everybody feel free as well to write your questions into Depth Psychology Alliance, and maybe we can continue this conversation as we go. So thank you. Ginger, I think that I saw a chat come in from you, so let's go to your question next since we couldn't get you on there. And let's see if I can find it. Okay, so Ginger writes, because she couldn't turn on her sound. Carol, can you share your thoughts on Hillary Clinton's archetypal journey with Bill as president and now as a candidate herself?
Oh gosh.
You got the hard one.
Not so hard. I have to say, I'm not privy to their inner life, about what their relationship actually is. So I can only say a few things about that, which is, it had to be enormously traumatic with the Monica Lewinsky thing for her. And right now, there are a lot of people who are putting her down because she stood by her man. But I think she stood by the country. I don't know if she stood by her man or not, but she stood by the country. So I have a sense that, and she didn't crumble. And so I think that was one of those traumas for her that strengthened her enormously and made her in some ways into another person. It is clear that they have some kind of fondness for one another. I'm thinking with Jean Boland's work, for example, she talks about Athena. I think it was Athena women, or maybe it was Hera women. Not crying and weeping and being jealous like Hera, but who actually, in the more positive way, would have been the ruler herself, and then wants to be president. And it is very likely, I would think, that what they have forged is a partnership that is a partnership about their collective work. I don't know about their private life. Maybe they're still sweethearts, but it seems to be that they're more partners for looking for the good they want to do in the world.
Yeah.
I think too, she's a tough broad, and it may have been that plus being attacked so much. And I'm not taking sides on this. I'm just saying what's happening to her, that I think that empathy that she always had for children and families and things like that, particularly saw as a young person, is taking the lead more now in her campaign. And we're seeing more of that caregiver side of her.
Great. Thank you, Carol. And thank you so much, Ginger, for the question. All right, we have several more, so I know we're nearing the end, but let's just do a few more of these if we can. And if people have to jump off, we understand that. Glenda, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, so you should be able to speak now, and feel free to turn on your video if you'd like. Hi, Glenda, are you there? Okay. Not seeing Glenda come on. Okay, so Glenda, please type in your question if you would still like to ask it. Alexander, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. Okay, we should be able to hear you. Hi.
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 I've been enjoying this. I was wondering if y'all are interested in the original Persephone myth. Are you familiar with that?
Well,
The Orphic one?
I'm familiar with a few, but go ahead. What is yours?
Do be brief if you would, as we're.
Well, it's pretty brief. It's in Carl Karenyi's Gods of the Greeks, where it's actually Zeus who is first seduced by his mother Rhea, which of course was Demeter, and they turn into snakes and copulate, and out of that copulation comes Persephone. And then
you're nodding like you're somewhat familiar with this, Carol. Would you like to?
I actually didn't know that one, but there's several of those really ones that I'm a little squeamish about. There's one in which Persephone is impregnated by her dad Zeus, which of course there was no incest taboos, but he turns into a snake or a serpent and impregnates her in her sleep. And I'm thinking, I don't like that one. But of course, there are all kinds of, if it were a dream image, you know, many of these things that seem kind of horrible, if you see them as dream images, there are all kinds of energies that a snake can represent, and that if you actually see it in that kind of way, some of them are evil, but a lot of them are really good. It's you know, the snake in ancient Greece was about transformation.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the question, Alexander. And I would just add to that that certainly snakes represent the bridge to the underworld, because they live underground a lot of the time, and yet they come up in order to soak up the sun and be in the upper world. So yeah, thank you.
That's also why they had snakes when they were doing dream incubation.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we're going to take one last question and then we'll wrap this up. And then people that have written questions in, I'm going to copy those and see if I can't paste them into Depth Psychology Alliance in the discussion section. And maybe Carol, you know, the two of us sort of look back at those and respond to those as we have time to do that. So I wanted to thank everybody who's written stuff in. So Wendy, I'm going to go to you and yeah, I guess got to figure out how to do that. And then Wendy will be our final panelist for the evening. I just have to find where your hand is, Wendy. Sorry. I can't find it. All right, so I don't know if she put her hand down or if she had to drop off. All right, so let's go ahead and just on that note, I think that it's a good place to end, and that is this whole idea, again, of bridging the underworld and the upper world. For me, this is such an important piece of it, because if we're not willing, each one of us, to go through that process and to present ourselves there at the brink of the cliff, if you will, or at the entrance to the underworld, and to look around and ask, you know, what gods are present. I'm reminded that Carl Jung said, in all chaos, there's a cosmos, and in all disorder, there is order. And that's one of my favorite quotes from Jung. And I truly believe that if we are willing to look to the unconscious and to begin to use these myths and these characters and these deities as as mile markers, if you will, ways to provide context for us in our lives, then we can certainly find ways to transform. So, Carol, I know that you have lots of upcoming events that you would like to share with us, so please just give us a quick rundown of those. And I assume people can also find them on your website at carolspearson.com.
I'll do it fast then, because I'm going to be at Casa de Maria and in Santa Barbara this weekend. The workshop is on Persephone Rising, but the really cool thing, since I didn't talk about Dionysus in this, and he's in my book, is that I'm going to be helped by an expert dancer who will help us be moving the archetypal stories in our bodies in a way that anybody can do, and even in a wheelchair, except most of us will be standing. And I just love that. I'll be in Washington, D.C. in Maryland at the Jung Society doing a presentation on narrative intelligence as a depth kind of narrative intelligence about how we become conscious of narratives and shift them. And I'll be at Omega in September back talking about Persephone Rising and having Gabi with me dancing, which is going to be really cool. So I hope anybody who liked this and would want to go deeper into experiencing these stories with other people, that you might find one of those places to be.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carol. Thank you so much for the great work that you're doing in the world. I so appreciate that you're sharing your gifts and that you're here with all of us today. And we so appreciate your support of Depth Psychology Alliance. Carol is writing a fairly regular blog on Depth Psychology Alliance, so please be sure to come back and read her blogs. And also you can find the book on Amazon, of course, and several other online sellers. So take a look at that if you don't have it already. Thanks everybody for being with us today, and we'll see you on Depth Psychology Alliance.
And thank you, Bonnie, for the great work you're doing there.
You're very welcome. Bye, everyone. Take care.